The year is 1565. The location is a barren, sun-scorched rock in the heart of the Mediterranean Sea. To the casual observer, the island of Malta looks insignificant, a limestone fortress surrounded by endless blue water. But in the 16th century, this tiny island was the most dangerous place on Earth. It was the shield of Christendom, and it was about to be struck by a hammer blow that would shake the world. Sailing towards this island was not just an army, but a force of nature. The Ottoman Empire, under the rule of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, had launched the greatest armada in history. Nearly 200 ships, their sails darkening the horizon, carried the Sultan's elite janissaries, the Spahis cavalry, and massive siege cannons capable of shattering city walls like glass. Their mission was singular and terrifying: absolute annihilation. The Sultan had declared that Malta must be erased from the map, the Knights of St. John slaughtered to the last man, and the gateway to Europe thrown wide open for Islamic conquest. Standing against this tidal wave was a force that, on paper, should have surrendered immediately. Inside the crumbling walls of Malta stood Grandmaster Jean Parisot de Valette. He was 70 years old, a man carved from the same hard stone as the island itself. He commanded a meager force of barely 6,000 men, a mix of noble European knights, Spanish mercenaries, and courageous Maltese peasants. They were outnumbered nearly 7 to 1. They had no retreat. There was no backup coming. They were, for all intents and purposes, dead men walking. But Valette was no ordinary leader. He was a veteran of the Siege of Rhodes 40 years earlier, where the knights had been driven from their home by the same enemy. He had spent a lifetime fighting the Ottomans, and he knew their mind. He knew that Suleiman saw the knights as pirates and infidels, a thorn in the side of his glorious empire. Valette gathered his knights in the flickering candlelight of the chapel of Fort St. Angelo. He looked into their eyes, men from France, Spain, Italy, and England, and spoke words that would echo through history. It is the great battle of the cross and the Quran which is now to be fought. A formidable army is descending upon us. We are the chosen soldiers of the cross, and if heaven requires the sacrifice of our lives, there can be no better occasion than this. On May 18th, the nightmare began. The Ottoman fleet was spotted. It was a floating city of war. As the ships anchored and began to unload their deadly cargo, the sound of 40,000 men and their heavy artillery terrified the villagers. The women and children crowded into the citadel of Medina and the fortified harbor towns of Birgu and Senglea, praying for a miracle. Valette ordered the crops to be harvested green or poisoned, the wells to be tainted with bitter herbs and dead animals. He would leave the invaders nothing but scorching heat and dusty rocks. The stage was set for a clash of civilizations. The unstoppable force of the Ottoman Empire had met the immovable object of the Knights of St. John. The Siege of Malta had begun.
Our faith. To the chains, quickly! Stop them, they are cutting the ropes. Kill the swimmers. Attack! Move forward! Get inside! Hold the line! Push them back! To victory!
The Ottoman commanders, Mustafa Pasha and Admiral Piale, made a fateful decision that would define the entire siege. Instead of attacking the main strongholds immediately or isolating the island to starve the defenders, they focused their rage on a tiny, star-shaped fortification guarding the entrance to the Grand Harbor, Fort St. Elmo. It was a small, seemingly insignificant structure, manned by a garrison of only a few hundred men. The Ottoman engineers calculated it would fall in 3 days. It was a calculation paid for in rivers of blood. The bombardment of St. Elmo began with a fury that defied imagination. The Ottomans dragged their massive basilisks, cannons so large they required dozens of oxen to move, into position. Day and night, iron and stone balls rained down on the fort, pulverizing the limestone walls into dust. The noise was so deafening it could be heard in Sicily, hundreds of miles away. But when the smoke cleared, the flag of the Order of St. John still waved defiantly above the ruins. The defenders of St. Elmo knew they were the sacrificial lambs. Valette had ordered them to hold to the last man to buy time for the main defenses to be strengthened. And hold they did. They fought with a ferocity that stunned the invaders. When the Janissaries, the Sultan's invincible shock troops, launched their human wave attacks, they were met with a new horror: Greek fire. The knights hurled hoops of fire, pots of boiling oil, and incendiary grenades that clung to the flowing robes of the attackers, turning them into living torches. The screams of burning men drowned out the roar of the cannons. The three-day siege dragged on for a week, then two, then three. The moat of St. Elmo filled with thousands of Ottoman bodies, yet still, the waves of attackers came. The legendary corsair Drugget Rice, the most feared pirate in the Mediterranean and a brilliant tactician, arrived to take command of the siege. He realized the mistake of focusing on St. Elmo, but it was too late to turn back. In a twist of fate, Drugget himself was struck by shrapnel from a cannonball. Some say fired by the defenders, others say it was friendly fire from his own guns. The death of their greatest commander sent a shockwave of grief through the Ottoman ranks, but it only fueled their desire for vengeance. By June 23rd, St. Elmo was no longer a fort. It was a pile of rubble. The few dozen surviving knights were too wounded to stand. In a final act of supreme defiance, they dragged chairs to the breach in the walls, sitting with their swords in hand to face the final assault. They died striking at the enemy until they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. St. Elmo finally fell, but the cost was staggering. 6,000 Ottoman soldiers, including their best elites, lay dead for a tiny heap of rocks.
Thank you, Grandma.
Mustafa Pasha, standing amidst the carnage and looking across the harbor at the massive fortress of St. Angelo, famously uttered the chilling words, "Allah, if so small a son has cost us so dear, what price shall we have to pay for the father?" The sacrifice of St. Elmo had bought Malta a precious month of time, but the true horror was just beginning. With the fall of St. Elmo, the Ottoman fury turned toward the two main peninsulas, Birgu, the headquarters of the Knights, and Senglea. Mustafa Pasha was under immense pressure. The summer heat was rising, disease was spreading in his camp, and he needed a quick victory. He devised a brutal plan, a double assault. He would attack Senglea by land and by sea simultaneously, crushing the defenders in a pincer movement. To attack by sea, the Ottomans had to drag their heavy boats overland across Mount Sybaris to avoid the guns of Fort St. Angelo. It was a feat of engineering genius. On July 15th, the attack began. A flotilla of boats carrying the fiercest Janissary killers launched towards the seawalls of Senglea. They expected an easy landing. They were wrong. Grandmaster Valette had foreseen this. He had constructed a secret battery of cannons at sea level, hidden from view. As the Ottoman boats crowded together, approaching the walls, the hidden gun ports opened. Point blank, the cannons roared. The devastation was absolute. Wooden boats shattered into splinters. Hundreds of soldiers were blown apart or thrown into the blood-red water. But the battle was not over. In the water, a savage primal struggle erupted. The Maltese, excellent swimmers who knew every inch of the harbor, dove into the water armed only with daggers. They attacked the drowning Ottoman sailors, pulling them under, stabbing them in the surf. It was a scene of total chaos. The amphibious assault was a disaster, but the land attack was relentless. The Ottoman artillery bombardment intensified. They were firing thousands of shots every single day. The walls of Birgu began to crumble. In August, a massive mine was detonated under the walls of the Castile bastion, blowing a massive hole in the defenses. Through the dust and smoke, the Janissaries poured in, planting their banners on the walls. Panic began to spread. The bells of the churches rang in alarm. The civilians shrieked, believing the end had come. It was at this moment that Jean de Valette became a legend. Seeing his lines wavering, the 70-year-old Grandmaster did not retreat to safety. He grabbed a pike and ran directly into the breach. He did not wear his helmet. He wanted his men to see his face. "Save the fortress," he screamed, charging into the mass of Turkish swords. The sight of their elderly leader fighting like a lion shamed the knights and soldiers. they rallied. Men who were wounded stood up to fight again. They countercharged with such ferocity that the Janissaries were pushed back. Valette was wounded in the leg, but he refused to be carried away until the breach was sealed and the enemy repulsed. The Grand Master had saved the city, but the defenders were reaching their breaking point.
Despair. We fight for every soul in Burgu. Hold fast, and we shall overcome this darkness.
Forward! Seize the bridge! Allahu Akbar! Hold the line! Push them back!
By late August, the Siege of Malta had descended into a hellscape. It was no longer a battle of strategy, it was a test of endurance in the face of oblivion. The summer sun baked the island, turning the armor of the knights into ovens. The stench of death hung heavy over the harbor, where thousands of bloated bodies floated in the water or lay unburied in the no-man's land between the trenches. Inside the fortress of Birgu, the situation was desperate. The water cisterns were running low. Food was rationed to starvation levels. There was almost no gunpowder left. Every man, woman, and child was involved in the defense. Women repaired the crumbling walls with rubble and stones under fire. Children carried water to the dying men at the ramparts. The hospitals were overflowing with the maimed and the sick. Yet in the face of this apocalypse, the spirit of the Maltese people and the knights remained unbroken. They gathered in the candlelit churches, praying for salvation, knowing that surrender meant slavery or death. But if the situation inside was bad, the situation outside in the Ottoman camp was catastrophic. The besiegers had become the besieged. Dysentery, typhoid, and fever swept through the Ottoman tents like a wildfire. The water supply was contaminated. Thousands of soldiers died not from Christian swords, but from microscopic bacteria. The invincible Janissaries, who had marched out of Constantinople with dreams of glory, were now demoralized, sick, and starving. Mustafa Pasha was growing desperate. He knew that the autumn storms were approaching. If he did not take Malta soon, the sailing season would end, leaving his fleet trapped and vulnerable. He ordered increasingly reckless attacks. He built a massive siege tower, higher than the walls of Birgu, to rain fire down on the defenders. But Valette's engineers tunneled out through the base of the wall and destroyed the tower with a precise cannon shot, bringing the wooden giant crashing down in flames. Psychological warfare reached its peak. The Ottomans tried to terrify the defenders by executing prisoners in plain sight. In response, Valette remained cold and unyielding. When an Ottoman envoy arrived demanding surrender, Valette pointed to the deep ditch surrounding the fort and said, "The only territory I will give you is the ditch to bury your dead." It was a stalemate of suffering. The Ottomans had the numbers, but the knights had the will. Both sides were staring into the abyss, waiting for the other to blink. The fate of Europe hung by a thread, suspended in the heat and blood of a tiny island.
Forward, men, for glory! Push them back! Do not let them escape! We have to get on board now! Pull me up! I can't hold on! Help! Man overboard!
On the morning of September 7th, 1565, a lookout on the crumbled walls of Medina rubbed his eyes in disbelief. On the northern horizon, the sea was filled with sails. But these were not Ottoman ships. They flew the banners of Spain in the Kingdom of Sicily. The Gran Soccorso, the Great Relief, had finally arrived. 8,000 fresh troops, the elite infantry of the Spanish Empire, landed at Melilla Bay. The news struck the Ottoman camp like a thunderbolt. Rumors flew through the ranks that the relief force was 50,000 strong. Panic, sheer and uncontrollable, seized the Ottoman army. Mustafa Pasha, the proud commander who had vowed to crush the infidels, stared at his broken army and realized the dream was over. He ordered a full retreat. The withdrawal was chaotic. Soldiers abandoned their heavy cannons, burned their tents, and trampled each other to get to the ships. The once disciplined Ottoman war machine dissolved into a terrified mob. The relief force did not just watch them leave, they charged. The Spanish infantry smashed into the retreating Ottoman rearguard. It was a slaughter. The invaders were driven into the sea, desperate to climb aboard their galleys as musket fire rained down on them. As the Ottoman fleet limped away from the island they had come to conquer, they left behind 30,000 of their finest men. The invincible tide of the Ottoman Empire had broken against the Rock of Malta. When the smoke finally cleared, the scale of the victory became apparent. Malta was a ruin. The fortifications were piles of dust, but the flag of St. John still flew. Grandmaster Jean de Valette, limping
I
and
will
exhausted,
tolerate this
walked out of the
failure
gates of
no
Birgu
longer.
to embrace the commander of the relief force. Tears streamed down the faces of the hardened survivors. They had achieved the impossible. The news of the victory spread across Europe like wildfire. Church bells rang in Rome, Paris, and Madrid. Queen Elizabeth I of England famously said, "If the Turks should prevail against the Isle of Malta, it is uncertain what further peril might follow to the rest of Christendom." The Knights of St. John were hailed as the saviors of Western civilization. In the aftermath, a new city was built on the high ground of Mount Sybaris, the site where the Ottomans had placed their cannons. It was built of golden limestone, a fortress city impregnable to attack. It was named Valette in honor of the man who refused to yield. The Siege of Malta was more than a battle. It was a turning point in history. It proved that the Ottoman Empire was not invincible. It showed the world that a small, united force, fueled by faith and courage, could withstand the greatest power on earth. Today, if you walk the streets of Valette, you are walking on hallowed ground, built upon the sacrifice of the brave few who stood against the many and won.